Welcome back everyone. I went ahead and caved in and actually bought myself a MacBook Pro, the 13-inch one with the M1 chip inside of it. Now, if you're not too sure what's going on, believe me, I barely even know, but I'll try my best to explain how well I know the MacBook Pro lineup. Basically, I started off the MacBook Pro lineup with the 13-inch. I loved it so much. I ended up using it for a long time, and even right now, my main MacBook Pro that I use pretty much for everything besides my iMac is a 2015 MacBook Pro, and I still have a 2015 iMac that I use. Like, I don't use one of these newer ones. I buy them, but I tend to return them or resell them. And with this M1 MacBook Pro I was using, it was actually a really good machine, and I like it a lot for the most part. I think a lot of people are overhyping it though. And when I look at something like the 16-inch MacBook Pro that I just bought not too long ago as well, pretty much I saw the same thing go on with both of them. Pretty much when they first come out, people overhype them like crazy, and then slowly over time, the hype kind of dies down, and then you kind of see how they really are. And with the M1 MacBook Pro, I think it's a great machine, but there are a couple of areas where I really don't like it too much, and those specific areas, the 16-inch MacBook Pro actually kind of shines in. Now, when I look at the future of both MacBooks, the M1 MacBook Pro actually does have a better future in my opinion. You'll be able to basically, use, this is how I'll put it. The M1 MacBook Pro, the newer software updates, the newer machines that are coming out, pretty much every single macOS thing that's ever going to come out is going to be more tailored for the M1 MacBooks than the Intel-based MacBooks. From what I'm seeing, we've kind of saw the same thing with iPhones. I mean, anytime a newer iPhone comes out, Apple rearranges iOS to work specifically for those new ones, and they kind of, leave the back ones even one generation behind. They kind of put those, on kind of like a back pedal where they focus in on the new ones. But I feel like with these chipsets, that's what Apple's kind of doing. They're going to be focusing on these newer, Apple Silicon chips inside. So I will tell you, the size thing, a lot of people say there's a big size difference. I'll be completely honest. There is a little bit of size difference for sure. Going from that 16-inch down to a 13-inch and vice versa, you're going to be either, saving a lot of storage or gaining a lot of storage when it comes down to the actual size. If you're putting it in your backpack and stuff, just know that 16-inch MacBook Pro is definitely a bigger machine. But I think with that extra, heft, there's a lot of, capability behind that machine too. And I wouldn't just say the M1 MacBook Pro is the better MacBook because everyone is saying it's faster and all that. I will tell you, the main thing people are going to see when it comes down to these two are the performance, inside of them. And I will tell you, if you're in a specific use case where you're a student, you're typing a bunch of papers, you're doing a bunch of things like that, I will tell you both these MacBooks are going to be perfectly fine. If you want to save some money and get a, $1299 MacBook Pro with the M1 chip, be my guest, that's going to be a really good machine and it'll be able to handle everything you throw at it. There's not really going to be a problem with it. But if you do need a little bit more power, I feel like the M1 MacBook Pro is going to be perfectly fine for those people as well. Whether you're a student, whether you're a huge graphic designer, whether you're somebody who makes a lot of videos, edits a lot of videos, whatever, the M1 MacBook Pro is going to be perfectly fine. But also on the flip side, a 2015 MacBook Pro like I use every day is perfectly fine for me, and I upload like 50,000 videos every single day. I'm doing a lot of stuff too, and I really used this MacBook during my whole entire academic career. So I will tell you, to be completely honest, you don't need the latest and greatest MacBook to do whatever you need to, and it's not just the newer MacBooks that can handle everything you throw at it. These older ones, like I said, are perfectly fine too. So don't just think that the M1 MacBook Pro is the perfect one for you, because even just the last generation or the last generation may be perfectly fine for you. Now that 16-inch MacBook Pro, I've seen a lot of conflicting stuff. People are saying, it's faster here, it's faster there. I could go down and just drill down on the specs and the cores and everything. I feel like the two main areas that I like to focus on though is the RAM, also the storage. There's only a limited, the base model storage of both are a little bit different, but just know the M1 MacBook Pro, even tailored to the same storage as the base model 16-inch MacBook Pro, is still far cheaper than the 16-inch MacBook Pro. So if cost is a thing, the M1 MacBook Pro is still going to be a better option. But there is one little area, well actually two, that the M1 MacBook Pro kind of, settles down in a little bit in terms of all the hype that's going around. And that's the USB Type-C ports. One thing that is really stopping me from using this specific MacBook as my main machine is actually the lack of the quad USB Type-C port option that we have on the 16-inch MacBook Pro. So even though the performance is great, even though, the M1 MacBook Pro is the greatest thing ever, However, the fact that there's only a 2 USB Type-C option on this M1 MacBook Pro kind of hinders a lot of what I would like to do with it. I like the ability of charging from both sides if I want to, but on top of that, I like the ability of, plugging in multiple things at once. Of course, you can get a USB Type-C hub and plug it in straight from there if you want to, but still having that, 4 USB Type-C, option is really awesome. I was kind of used to using a, MacBook Retina, the 12-inch one with the 1 USB Type-C port, and it was the worst experience ever. I can probably get by with a 2 USB Type-C port option, but I will tell you, having that 4 USB Type-C port option like the 16-inch MacBook Pro has is something that I really, really do like, and I'm willing to, get a bigger MacBook if it does, end up being that I will have that quad USB Type-C option. Now, I feel like within the next year or two, Apple is going to drop the rest of the Intel lineup on their MacBooks, the 13-inch lineup, and pretty much add all of them with 4 USB Type-C ports. And that's a very, funny thing and a very smart thing that Apple did, was to still have, some things that the M1 MacBook Pro isn't the greatest in. So when it comes down to that specific area, the USB Type-C port will be a pretty big option between both, but the 16-inch MacBook Pro definitely wins there. The build quality is almost exactly the same. You're not going to feel like one is way better than the other one in terms of build quality. Some people say the speakers on the 16-inch MacBook Pro are better. I really don't care about the speakers that much. The main thing that I care about is pretty much, does the MacBook have issues? From the year that the 16-inch MacBook Pro has been out, I really haven't had too many issues, to be honest. When I used it, the one little thing that I hated about it was that for some reason the fans would just always turn on, and apparently that's a feature because it's like a part of the thermal throttling. It's not going to do that. The 13-inch MacBook Pro with the M1 chip, it really hasn't turned the fans on at all, and that's a really awesome thing about it. I hate when I'm, editing a video or I'm recording a video, especially into the computer with a mic, and you just hear that huge fan in the background. My iMac doesn't have it. My 2015 MacBook Pro does that all the time. And my 16-inch MacBook Pro did that all the time too, and that was very, very annoying. That was a horrible feature about it. With the 13-inch MacBook Pro, I'm assuming with that M1 chip, the fans never really turned on, which is awesome. Also, the MacBook Air with the M1 chip doesn't even have a fan, so I might actually swing for that one, but that's a really cool feature that the M1 MacBook Pro has. It doesn't really ramp up the fans that much, but if you're not, recording videos into your mic on the MacBook Pro, it doesn't really matter too much. In terms of longevity, in terms of the software standpoint, both these are going to be lasting for a very long time, but because the Apple Silicon chip is, Apple's own, I feel like they're going to have some software improvements for the M1 chip that's going to make it more optimized in the future. And I think apps like Final Cut Pro, Logic Pro, any other native app that Apple makes is going to be more tailored for the M1 chip. So right now there may not be any differences for the most part, but I feel like eventually down the line, especially with the fact that the M1 MacBooks can actually support iPhone apps and iPad apps to, run on the MacBook, that's a huge thing. Now, technically, they can still run on, a 16-inch MacBook if you want to compile them in Xcode, but for sure, the M1 MacBook Pro definitely wins inside of that specific standpoint. But like I said, it's not necessarily just all perfect. One thing that I like about the 16-inch MacBook Pro is actually the bigger display. I like having a bigger size display for sure, and with the keyboard, I just feel like, I just feel like the whole entire machine kind of is tailored a little bit to me. And also, the 13-inch MacBook Pro still kind of has an older design, even though obviously these two are kind of designed the same. There is less bezel on the 16-inch MacBook Pro than on the 13-inch one. So that's definitely something to keep in mind as well. I'm not going to sit here and say, this MacBook is an older design either, because it looks good. They both look good. But the 16-inch MacBook Pro does have a little bit of a newer design when it comes down to it. In terms of battery life, I also have heard a lot of people say the M1 MacBook Pro is the better one in terms of that too. And I think the M1 MacBook Pro has a really good battery life inside of it, especially with that M1 chip. It's more optimized. The Intel-based MacBooks, I actually didn't even have that big of a problem with a 16-inch MacBook. I felt like that battery life was actually pretty good too. But because of what I've been hearing and from my experience, I can only assume that the M1 MacBook Pro will probably win when it comes down to the battery life department. So to answer the question, basically, which one should you pick up? Should you pick up that 16-inch MacBook Pro from 2019, or should you pick up an M1 MacBook Pro? Now, I will tell you, if you have to pick one up right now and it has to be brand new, I will definitely tell you, I feel like the biggest differences between these two right now aren't even going to be affecting either one right now. I feel like a lot of the M1 MacBook Pro features and everything that are going to be happening is pretty much going to be happening in the future. I feel like it's not going to be happening right now. All the crazy software improvements, all those iPhone, iPad apps that are going to be supported and probably natively built into macOS, and all those other software improvements that I'm thinking of, or what Apple could potentially do, are going to be happening in the future. I think right now, if you need to pick up a MacBook, I will probably say if you want to future-proof yourself as much as possible, the M1 MacBook Pro is probably the better way to go if you like having a smaller design. But do keep in mind that this thing taps out as 16 gigabytes of RAM. You can't really go any higher than that. You can upgrade the storage all you want to, which is awesome. These things have 8 cores built in, which is awesome. But just keep in mind, like I said, that 2 USB port option. There's only 2 USB Type-C ports on this thing. So if you're okay with that, then by all means go for it. I think you're going to have a really, really good time with it. If you think about it as well, this thing is going to be, you're going to be set for years and years to come. But if you do feel like you want another MacBook that's going to have, a bigger display, still pretty good, this is an extremely good performing machine. I don't think people really understand. If you're not comparing them side by side, I say this thing about iPhones too. If you have an iPhone, if you have all the money in the world, get the 12 Pro Max. But if you have some money to spare, then definitely, an iPhone 11 or an iPhone 10 is a really good a phone still too. And it's not like you need to go and upgrade just because it's the newer one. If you have a 16-inch MacBook Pro, I would definitely tell you to keep it. I wouldn't side grade to an M1 MacBook Pro. I feel like these two things kind of live in their own though too. Like the 16-inch MacBook Pro would probably end up being the one I would pick up personally because of the bigger display, because of the bigger machine, and because of the 4 USB Type-C port option. But the M1 MacBook Pro, for the price tag and for what type of value you're getting, it's extremely beautiful. The performance I was getting from this thing is really good as well, and I have nothing to complain about for sure. But with the 16-inch MacBook Pro, I didn't like how the fans ramped up and stuff. But more than anything, if you can just wait it out a year, if you can just give it a year, I guarantee you from what I'm hearing and the rumors that are circulating, there's going to be an 16-inch M1 MacBook Pro that's going to be coming out probably from the quarter first of 2020 from what I've read on Twitter. I take that with a grain of salt. I don't know if maybe it'll come 5 years from now, but that's kind of what I'm hearing. So if you're really indecisive, there's no harm in waiting. You're not going to, these things are only going to get cheaper in the used market. I've seen a lot of 16-inch MacBook Pros go for like $1,500 in the used market too. So I will tell you, just wait it out if you can. If you're in a hurry though, then definitely I would probably recommend getting the M1 MacBook Pro as a cheaper one. It has a really good feature ahead of it and the performance is really, really good for that type of money that you're dropping on it. But with the 16-inch MacBook Pro, if you want that bigger MacBook, I say go for it. So that really pretty much covers it up. If you guys have any other questions or anything, let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that would mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. Every single subscriber that we get really does count. So it means so much if you guys can hit that. Also check out the other links down in the description as well. My Twitter, my Instagram, my other channels. More importantly, everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.